My name is Ben Kinney. I'm publisher of Business North Carolina Magazine. I'm also happy to be publisher of the North Carolina Tribune, which, if y'all are familiar with, our very own Colin Campbell is editor of that, and that is a daily political newsletter that we launched almost a year ago. And unfortunately, Colin was supposed to moderate today, but he's held up with the flu. That's what happens when you have a 2-year-old that goes to daycare. It's kind of walking virus came into his house from that standpoint. But I'm happy to do this. I've done it in the past. We have been doing this for many years, and also I've done it in cooperation with Campbell, with the Lundy-Fetterman Business School, and it's just been a really good partnership. We've really enjoyed it. This is a little bit different than most of the roundtables that you will see around this time. They're popping up everywhere, as you know. It's usually kind of one person does an economic forecast. What we've always done is brought in some different folks from different industries to talk a little bit about, specifically to their industry, what is the economy looking like in 2023. And I do not envy any of you gentlemen, because this is going to be a weird year from that standpoint. But then again, has it not been weird for the past 3 years? You know, in 2020 we're talking about COVID. You know, how do you react to that? 2021 we're talking about, you know, supply chain issues and baby formula and stuff. Remember, baby formula was a big deal. Just those kind of aspects are just all over the place. This year we're talking about all those things are still kind of baked into the cake, but we're also facing maybe a possible recession. If we do, is it going to be a soft landing? Is there going to be one? We're in a weird position here in North Carolina because our economy is doing very well compared to a lot of other places in the country. You know, from an economic development, and Tony, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit. We just had economic development announcements like crazy over 2022. It's probably going to continue, I would hope, in 2023. But these folks are going to kind of give you some really good insight into those aspects of them. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. First, what we'll do is just start off. I'd just like it just to kind of go down the row here and have each one of them just give us an introduction and tell us a little bit about yourself, and also a little bit about the organization that you represent. And Mark, we'll kick it off with you.
Okay. I'm Mark Steckbeck. I am the Lundy Chair of Business Philosophy and the Associate Professor of Economics at Campbell University. I also am the Director of the Truist Scholars Program. I represent Campbell University, and I think you just got a good PR pitch for Campbell about 5 minutes ago, so I don't need to go into it anymore. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. Representative Sain.
Yep. Good afternoon. I'm Representative Jason Sain. I represent Lincoln County. I am the Senior Appropriations Chairman of the House, which means with all the money that we keep bringing back into North Carolina, with all the great business that's coming in and the great business activity, we get to spend that on your behalf. It's interesting to be in the position we're in. When you talk about the last 3 years being quite crazy as an appropriator, I thought it'd be a lot of fun. It's been more fun than I can stand, but we've gotten through it. And but I live in Lincolnton. My wife Catherine is director of our Senior Services Center in Lincolnton. We have a son Jackson who's 14 and loves basketball. And I was supposed to go up to D.C. Thank God I didn't do that. LeBron James was in Charlotte Monday night, and he wanted to go see that. I think I made the best choice because the show continues in D.C. We will not have that in Raleigh, but I'll tell you more about that later. So.
That's awesome. Great. Thanks. Adam.
That might be a tough one to follow. I'm Adam Curry. I'm the Chief Banking Officer at First Bank. First Bank is a $12 billion financial institution headquartered in Southern Pines, North Carolina, right down the road. We have about 125 branches covering North and South Carolina and cover every major market in the Carolinas. We're still a community bank that's been around for 85 years and intend to be for 85 more.
That's great. Tony.
I'm Tony Copeland. I'm the most recent former Secretary of Commerce in North Carolina. I left Commerce in 2021. For those almost 5 years that I was there, I used to brag about that I was a recovering attorney. Now I've entered back on the dark side. I'm a partner at Brooks Pierce, and we're a full-service law firm primarily in Greensboro, Raleigh, and Wilmington, and primarily geared towards the corporate sector.
Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Woody. I'm President and CEO of the North Carolina Rural Center. I'm a native rural North Carolinian, and I have one of the greatest jobs in the world, I think, working for the place that I really care about and love, rural North Carolina. It's great to be on the urban campus of Campbell University, one of our great rural universities, independent universities. And everywhere I turn, every time I go to a small town, I'm running into Campbell lawyers and Campbell MBA students or graduates, now pharmacists, now civil engineers, that are returning to often the places that they've called home their entire lives and making an impact on those places. So I think it's particularly appropriate for me and a thrill for me to be part of this conversation at this institution. So thank you.
Thank you. Chuck.
Hi, I'm Chuck Mattina. I'm the Senior Vice President of Insights and Analytics at Sales Factory, which is a data-driven marketing and insights company based in Greensboro. We have about 75 employees. Most of them are in Greensboro, but we have about 15 here in the Wells Fargo Center as well. We have a particular focus for clients that sell products and services through home improvement retail. So we focus a lot on consumers and housing and how that all impacts clients like the ones we have.
What we'll do is, if we can, is I'll ask each panelist kind of from their perspective what their kind of an overview of what they'll see in 2023. We'll kind of take it from there, and then we'll kind of go. I'll throw out some specific questions, or not specific, just some general questions, and y'all can answer as you see fit. This, just as an FYI, this is going to be in our February issue of Business North Carolina magazine. We're also this is how old I am, I keep saying this, we're going to videotape it. It's going to be on Betamax, so anyone that has a Betamax can probably, if you can rev that puppy up and enjoy it. No, we're videoing this, and what we're going to do is next week we're going to put forth probably the first a good portion of it for everyone to see on our YouTube channel as well. From that standpoint, so we'll get things started. Mark, can you give us kind of a general overview, like you always do so well each year?
Sure. The Betamax, I just got rid of mine about 5 years ago, so I can't say much. It was a harried morning, so I forgot my notes. Fortunately, I did pull them up, so I'll be referring to this. 3 to 6 months ago, if you asked me how things are going, I would tell you not that great, and I was really concerned about a hard landing. I will say things that have happened since November have eased that quite a bit. I think we're actually looking at a much better prospect, although I still pretty certain we'll be in a recession sometime this year. I would 80% guess that. I think most economists would argue with that. A couple of things that we do look at, some of the data that has come out has shown that. But let's start with some of the good parts, and why I was so pessimistic before was, of course, inflation hitting over 9%. Most recent number was 7.1%. That's a big drop. More importantly, if you break it down into core inflation, that was a little bit, about 6%. Net out used cars and housing, which I know those are big things, but now you're getting down to about 4%. And so really there are a few things that have been pushing that up, and those are starting to be alleviated. Used cars, of course, given the supply chain, is getting new cars back on. We are seeing the supply chains coming back to normal. The strong dollar, because of the Fed's rate increases, has reduced export demand, which is helping to alleviate inflation. So I think what we're seeing are some good signs of, again, as Ben was saying, it's a unique time. We're seeing a recession somewhat, recession indicators, but strong employment, numbers, very low unemployment. And so these are things that anything can change rapidly. We were talking about, the supply chain a year or 2 years ago. Well, today we now have to worry about some geopolitical issues that may instantaneously change things. So what I'll talk about is things that I see happening, where I think we're going to be this year, and keep in mind there are always things that can change. Again, thinking and netting out food and energy, those were 10.1%, 13.6% respectively in terms of inflation, and that was a huge impact. So we look at food, and people want to talk about, well, food is an important thing when you net that out, but food tends to be very volatile. Things can happen quickly, but we're also seeing that number come down as well. So I do think that we're going to see this, and the bigger part is commodities prices are now falling, and that's been a huge blessing to see. So what are the concerns, and why do I think we're heading towards a recession? The Conference Board's leading index is a great indicator of this. I use a coincidence index to it. It's the same. This is an index of unemployment rate, non-farm payroll, new orders, things like that. Well, that's been negative for a little while. It took another big hit. We're now down. It's about 3.9. I'm sorry. It's about let's say 3.9% to around 5.5%. The unemployment has done that, so that's been an impact in North Carolina. But the leading index has been negative now for most of this year, and it's decreased a lot since February, and that's a big indicator. We tend to see when it dropped below a 5%, negative 5% level, then it's always been followed by a recession, and we've gone beyond that. We're about 3.7%, and now this past year, when we annualize it, it's over 5%. So I'm pretty certain, that's a good indicator. The other thing we're looking at is, again, the unemployment rate, which was nationally 3.5%. It's now 3.7%. For North Carolina, it's 3.9%. But one thing we do see was when the unemployment rate increases by half a percentage point over its average for the year, which again about 3.5%, that tends to be an indicator of a recession. Again, we're only 0.2% there, but that's 40% of the way, and I think we're going to see more unemployment picking up in the next few months, and that's going to move us above the 0.5%. So that's going to be something to keep in mind. So we're not there yet, but we're seeing indication of this happening. The last thing is, whenever the Fed has had to reduce inflation by raising interest rates, that's always been followed by a recession for the past 50 years. And so we really are looking, sometime this year, we will be facing a recession. Question is, will it be a hard or soft landing? If it's light, I think in North Carolina, again, we're 3.9% unemployment now, probably somewhere about 5.5%. That's where we're looking at nationally. North Carolina may be a little less than that, but I would still look at a prediction of about 5.5% for this year. We could look at maybe 1% reduction in GDP, and lasting probably anywhere from 3 to 6 months if we have a soft landing. If it's a little harder, we're probably looking at unemployment 6%, maybe 7%, which would be pretty high. We'd look at a 2% decrease in GDP, and something that might last a year or even more. I think the possibility of that happening, like I said, just in the past few months, I think that scenario has lessened. I think the economists are more in line with looking at the softer landing. That's certainly where I think we're headed. Now, with North Carolina, we are in a unique situation. We have a lot of growth happening here. We're the ninth most populous state with the 9th fastest growing population, and we were just nominated the #1 for economic development in the United States. Chris Chung would be happy to report 100,000 jobs and $110 billion in business investments happening here. We're seeing a lot of growth happening. We're seeing tourism picking up. We're seeing some of the manufacturing. It dropped, but it picked up again. Sales have picked up a little bit in December. So we're seeing some signs here in North Carolina of it's been a little soft, but things over December have picked up a little bit. Whether that sustains itself throughout the year is yet to be seen. But I think we are in a better position than most states. We have a pretty diverse economy. We are seeing a lot picking up in different areas. I know mining is one, but mining is a very small part of our economy. That's one area that's probably looking pretty good. But we're also looking at business services as something that we're growing, which is a larger part of our economy.
Thank you. Jason, what, from your standpoint, from the legislative standpoint as well, you kind of know you got a plan, set up and stuff like that. So what are you looking at?
Yeah, no, so for us, you end up with, we had a lot of retirements, whether they were voluntary or forced through the elections. So we got some new faces at the legislative building. We're just one short of a supermajority in the House of Republicans. We've been close over the last several years, but have worked on bipartisan legislation and bills and budgets over the last years. Anyway, we finally found a way to work on budgets with the administration where we can get those signed, which is good news for everybody because that means that we don't have a lot of conflict other than what you'd expect at the legislative building. Nothing, like I say, nothing like what's happening in D.C. right now. Thank God. A small supermajority in the Senate, and of course, been working with Governor Cooper on his priorities as well. We're in a good place. We've been able to. I'm an appropriator who doesn't really like to spend money. I was once upon a time the finance chairman, so I know what it takes to raise those dollars. So I also know what it means when we spend those dollars. So we've been very wise at how we've invested in our state. When you look at the good news that we have, I too believe it will probably be much softer and a lot easier for us in our state than what I've seen in other states. I was on a panel in San Diego a couple weeks ago with the Senate leader from Washington State and the House Speaker from Massachusetts. I will tell you, we are in much better shape than some other states. They took all the federal money and pretty much burned through it and didn't wisely invest it. I think some of the things that we did, because we were forced to, in terms of investing in broadband across the state and being able to accelerate what the feds were already doing and allocating dollars to states, we're really getting a lot of our rural coverage, which means some really great things for us in terms of the pandemic showed where our weaknesses were. However, it also gave us targets and where we need to go improve, and I think this means a lot to a lot of our rural communities. You can't come fast enough if you don't have high-speed internet, but we're getting there, and that certainly shapes everything else. It shapes education. It shapes healthcare. It really touches all parts of the economy. So we want to make sure that we stay on track there. Good to see that inflation is coming down because we've got a lot of building that's going on. We've put together a capital expenditure fund over the last several legislative sessions that we keep reinvesting back in the state, and it's become part of what we do. Just almost automatic. We just got to go pick where we're investing in our university system and our community colleges and our workforce. The other thing that we know and can always be improved upon is what we're doing to develop that next workforce. It's incredibly important. We can't stay stagnant with the interest of having a great economy and having the right tax structure here in our state. Companies are looking to come to us, and companies who are here are looking to expand. And so we know that having that workforce and developing that workforce is crucial. So those will be priorities that happen at the legislative building. We've got other kind of top line things that will stay headlines, whether or not we expand Medicaid. I won't make any predictions there. It certainly is, I think it's a better place than it was last session, but I don't know if that is something that comes to fruition. A lot has to happen between now and then. We'll have hot topics like sports betting and medical marijuana that will always surface to the top, I'm sure, and those take up a lot of space in the room. But really keeping sure, and one thing that you can be sure of is from an economic standpoint and from where we're going as a state, we've been pretty methodical. We've looked at it as a marathon, not a sprint. The tax reform that's coming, that's already baked into the budget that we just passed last year, that's lowering rates for individuals and corporations. That's still on track, so there's certainty there. We like certainty as far as legislators in terms of really planning those things. We like to fight about the exciting things you see on television, and that's great theater. But the underlying current is that we're keeping pretty much things steady in North Carolina, so that when folks look at how they're going to shape their business, how they're going to invest, and where they're going to spend their dollars, we look like a state to most people that looks like a good bet, because we are, and we've done that over the last decade, 12 years, and we want to stay there. When I came into the legislature, one of the reasons I got to the legislature is because unemployment was so high at the time. In my county, it was 11% when I got here, and I was one of those unemployed people. So legislative pay is not much, but it pays more than nothing, as my wife told me at the time. But we have really set things in a good trajectory to keep that as minimized as possible. We'll certainly suffer as the economy runs through its cycle, but I think we're going to be in a much better place than most states, and really because the other thing that we have been very good about doing is squirreling away money. As my son tells me, he's 14, so he's a bit of a smartass like his dad, but he says, Dad, you can make anything into a sandwich. And which is true. I'm very frugal in that regard, but I think it kind of sums up what we've done at the legislative building, and working through this over the last several years. Is that we've known that recessions come, and we know that we have to plan for that. So we have, I think, done very well at making sure that we're going to be in a good financial place. The other real concern that I think we have to look at, and we'll find out more, I'm sure, as the year goes on, is the learning loss that came with COVID. And what we're going to have to do to remediate that, to get our kids caught back up and improved upon as far as their educational experience, because we want to make sure that we can't ignore that. We're going to have to do something about it. We know what decisions will be made on that. I'm unsure, but we do know that will be a problem that we have to deal with. So those are the things that we'll look at the legislative building. Hopefully not anything too controversial. But that that's the legislative business that we do. But I do think from a leadership perspective, and from talking to my friends on the other side of the aisle, people are ready to get to work. I think we're at a good place. There's plenty of friendships. We've found ways to do that over the last several years without a lot of the acrimony that comes sometimes with the legislative process. So it's not sexy, and it doesn't necessarily make headlines when we're not fighting. But I think most of us prefer it that way.
Definitely, sure. Two things that stick out there. Did you get the pimento cheese when you were making that sandwich?
I did.
I know.
Yeah.
I'm the same way. My kids get on me too about not messing with that from that standpoint. Adam, I've had the pleasure of having this man on a podcast before and stuff like that. And I will say, in addition to, knowing everything about finance, community banking in the state and stuff like that, he's also been to more concerts than I have been in the past year, which is saying something if you listen to the podcast from that standpoint. So, Adam, from your standpoint, what are you looking at for 2023?
More concerts.
All right.
Now you've thrown me off.
Sorry.
I'm trying to be professional up here. So I've been on this panel a few times before. I think I've always predicted a tough year ahead, and I might finally be right. And predict the same thing again. I will say it's a lot nicer to be with these folks in person, in this room in person, than it has been the last couple of years. I just like my colleagues up here, believe there will probably be a recession in 2023. As I look forward, though, and I'm a banker, so I always worry about these things, I think there's a lot of recency bias that we put on this. I thought, you putting numbers to it was really interesting, right? If we think about, 5% unemployment, right? It's pretty normal, right? And if you think about 1% shrinking of GDP, that's okay. Most companies and most individuals can absorb that. And that's not to say that there won't be some pain, but if you think about the last two recessions that we've been through at the start of COVID, with unemployment being suddenly overnight 15 or 17%, and suddenly overnight losing 30% of GDP, I don't foresee that happening again in 2023. And then if you look back to 2008, right, which was the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression and kind of a once-in-a-century type event, I don't see that happening either. So when we talk about a recession or economic softness, soft landing, hard landing, all of the buzzwords that you hear thrown around, what is reality? Reality is we probably have a slower year this year than we've had in the past. Things probably need to slow down a little bit. I think obviously prices and inflation need to slow. I think employment needs to slow a little bit. I'm sure there are other business leaders in this room that are having trouble hiring great people and attracting great people. And I think they're just, I think this year is going to provide a little bit of equilibrium, right? A little bit of balancing. And I think there will be some tough times ahead, but I think as a country and more as a state, we're probably better positioned to absorb them than we have been in the past. I think as far as North Carolina goes, I'm a native North Carolinian. I love this place, and so I'm biased, right? But on top of that, I don't think there's a place in the country that you'd rather be. As both someone in business and just to live your life. I think part of it's because of the great local government we have in state government. I think part of it's the climate, the business climate. Everything's kind of working together for North Carolina right now. So whatever happens in the country as a whole, I do think that we're in a much better position here in North Carolina. I keep looking for data, and you did a great job of giving some data earlier. When I look at data, I'm looking at statewide, I'm looking at national data, but I also look at our company, right? And some of the things that I look for are our credit card balances increasing, our home equity line balances increasing, our checking account balances decreasing. And I'm talking about across 2 states and 300,000 customers. And we're not seeing that stuff yet. We're seeing credit card balances go up slightly. We're seeing home equity line balances going up slightly, but checking account balances are staying pretty steady amongst businesses and individuals. So we'll continue to monitor those things. We joke at our bank, and some people probably make fun of me and our CEO that we're chasing ghosts a lot, right? That we're trying to look around the corner and find this ghost that hasn't been there yet. I do think that the ghost will appear at some point this year, but I think we'll all be pretty well positioned to absorb it and move through it relatively quickly.
That's good insight. Tony, economic development, obviously huge year last year. What can we look for next year? Or this year, excuse me.
I think you look more of the same. Since 2017, North Carolina set a record for jobs and capital investment in the history of the state. Even going through the pandemic that we went through in 2020, when we shut down everything but essential businesses and construction, we had the largest capital investment and job growth that we've had in the history of the state. Now, it was a K curve. I mean, it was based, people under $35,000 a year in the entertainment industry, they wouldn't agree with what I'm saying about things being so great. But the fundamentals of the state are sound. And even with the Fed continuing to use the blunt stick of raising interest rates, I think North Carolina will weather this and get through it. We have too many fundamental things in place. Number one is we have a tax structure, thanks to the legislature now, that gives an authorizing environment for all of us, both individuals and companies, to prosper and grow. We've also seen the first time, what started in 2017, I'll say, the legislature is aggressively involved in economic development. If you look at every major project that's come in the state since 2017, it has either been led or actively run by the General Assembly. They have passed new incentive measures for them. They have actually appropriated cash for infrastructure, and I don't see that stopping. Representative Sane can speak to us, but it has put us on a new level of economic development that we weren't on before. And if you look at the pipeline now of everything, it's not just electric batteries, which everyone's talking about, the electric industry. The pipeline is still full. I mean, life sciences is still moving forward. Many of these companies, they've been budgeted for years to do this, so they're not dependent on raising the next tranche of high yield money to go forward. And so I think we're going to weather it fine. The other side of this, which makes us really unique, is workforce. We're one of the only states in the country that has 700,000 people enrolled in any given day in private and public universities and community colleges. There's a pipeline for employees. Well, also, in-migration continues. We grew 1 million people during the last 10 years. We've doubled our population size since 1968. We've gone from 5 million to 10 million people. And we're continuing to do that. In-migration keeps growth going. But if you have a government that's pro-business, and then you provide the infrastructure and the talent here, there's nothing you can't accomplish. I don't see that slowing down. When I was secretary in 2020, when we shut the state down for all practical purposes, right before that, unemployment was at 3.5%. Somewhere around where we are now, we're at 3.5. But what hasn't come back is a labor participation rate. That is still, and speaking with different people. No one really knows what that means. I think most people will agree it's not because people won't come back to work at this point. I think most of that money's finished sloshing around in the economy. But I think a lot of people that my age probably retired and didn't come back. So I don't think that's necessarily a negative thing for what's going on with us in North Carolina. But I think our continued funding for education, having a tax system, and the other thing that we have done is we have invested in infrastructure and continuing to, as Representative Sane will say, the legislature this year even appropriated money to study and develop mega sites. Now, I would say we need more than mega sites because there's a lot of projects that employs, Pratt & Whitney is employing 1,000 people on 100 acres. And if you look at every one of these projects that have major legislative involvement with the legislature, whether it be Toyota, VinFast, Pratt & Whitney, Honeywell, all of these big projects have been a joint venture between the legislature and the executive branch. And as long as that continues, we can see South Carolina in a rearview mirror.
That's great. Thank you. Patrick, you're representing more or less an industry than a region of North Carolina. So that's kind of a very unique perspective. From the rural areas of the state, what are you looking at for 2023?
Well, I guess I would begin by saying I'm a 30+ year rural economic developer, so I'm an eternal optimist. You have to be if you're going to be in this career. And I really am optimistic, and I agree with so much of what's been said and a lot of the insights that have already been shared with you today. I think at the Rural Center, as we look at the demographics and the way the state is changing, it is incredible to me how much this state has changed in the amount of time over the years it has changed. On Saturday, the Rural Center will be 37 years old, and if you go back to the day we opened our doors in 1987, almost 60% of the population of the state were rural citizens in 1987. Today, we're at about 34% of the population. For the first time in the state's history, we're equally divided between rural, urban, and suburban citizens. And from an economic standpoint, as we do our work at the Rural Center, the one thing that really does stand out to me, so a lot of things stand out, but one of the things that stands out to me is there's more variation among those 3.6 million rural North Carolinians that live in 78 rural counties in North Carolina than there is among the urban and suburban counties, the 16 suburban counties and the 6 urban counties. How well you're doing, how you may feel about the economy does have a lot to do with the geography of this state and where you're standing within that geography at a given point in time. And there clearly are places that are struggling, that have bigger challenges than other places have. Often I find in our work what we're constantly kind of doing is not pushing back against false perceptions, but taking people's perceptions and helping them see that it actually is deeper than that. It goes further than that. And one of the common perceptions is that everybody's leaving rural North Carolina. Everybody's leaving rural, they're going someplace else. It's actually not true. There are 51 counties in this state that between 2010 and 2020 lost population. If you look at those, and all 51 of those were rural counties. And the most significant population among those counties was really concentrated in, around 20 counties, and it was fairly pronounced. But in 30 of those counties that lost population, it is really minor and not even. We'll see what the future holds, the next few years hold, but it's not really cause for alarm in terms of last one out, turn out the lights. But I do think we need to be prepared, and I think the state certainly recognizes this. I am amazed by, if you told me the investments we would have been making in rural broadband, in infrastructure, in workforce development, in some of the decisions Representative saying that you all made last year and last several years. I remember talking to you and fighting for a state-based rural broadband grants program and asking for $10 million a year. Over the next 5 years, we're going to have $3 billion from a combination of federal and state sources that are aimed toward addressing this issue of getting rural broadband infrastructure to every home and every business in every place all across this state. That being said, it's not an easy undertaking, and it will not be without its bumps in the roads, and the places that need it the most, that could benefit it from the most, are the places that are most ill-equipped to take advantage of those resources. So that is my challenge. I mean, I feel that as a personal challenge. I feel that as a challenge that the Rural Center is grappling with, along with a lot of other strategic partners that we have, like the Association of County Commissioners, the League of Municipalities. We've got our work cut out for us, but we've made some really smart strategic huge decisions about where we're going to invest in this state. And I think it does bode well for the rural parts of this state. We just can't lose sight of the fact that there are some places that clearly have been left behind. And they haven't been left behind in sort of this COVID era that we are living through. They've been left behind arguably since the turn of the century. And you can really see how that plays out in the numbers. So we got to really pay attention to those places and care about those places. But I think a lot of the fundamentals are sound. I hear optimism from even those more isolated rural parts of the state, from the leadership that is there that I haven't, and enthusiasm that I haven't quite felt in a while. So I'm going to take encouragement from that. I think we probably got a tough year ahead in some respects, but I totally agree with the fundamentals being sound. And I think Secretary Copeland is right that we're going to continue to see economic development success in this state because we've gotten the fundamentals right and we're doing it in the right way and the right approach, and we're doing it with a lot of cooperation across a lot of different partnering organizations in both the public and private sectors. And I think that's vitally important, and the glass is over half full. I feel pretty good.
So Chuck, the folks that y'all, your customers, your clients, and things like that, the information that you provide them, and I will say, Chuck's boss, Jed, is the CEO of the Sales Factory, and sends out a really great email once a week. It kind of gives a really good idea of consumer spending, housing, and all those kind of things. So plug for that. But what from your viewpoint, what do y'all see in 2023?
Well, sure. You can't talk about the economy without talking about the consumer, because consumer spending makes up 70% of the U.S. economy. So I think instead of talking about where do we see the economy going in 2023, I'll talk a little bit about where do we see the consumer going in 2023. And if and what's interesting from where we sit is that consumer behavior is intrinsically linked to consumer confidence. So if you're a consumer, where are you sitting today? You're thinking about what they're hearing in the marketplace. We may have 3.7% unemployment, but they're hearing about the 153,000 tech jobs that have recently been lost in companies including Cisco, which has a presence here. So that's got to worry some of them. If you open up the paper this morning, you saw Salesforce announcing 10% cuts in 2023. Vimeo is going to reduce their workforce by 11%. Goldman Sachs is going to cut by 8%. So they're already hearing essentially day one of 2023, more job cuts coming. Even companies that have done well during the pandemic, like PepsiCo, are looking to cut back their workforce because so many companies ramped up workforce during the pandemic and now are realizing they're way overstaffed, and even though they're doing well, they're going to have to start cutting back some of their workforce as well. So they're not hearing a lot of great things right now in terms of the job market. What are they seeing? And you talked about a little of this in terms of the bank accounts and everything else. Holiday debt was 24% higher this year than last year. So it's going to take people longer to pay off those Christmas presents this year than it was last year. The other thing is, if we think about the checking accounts, prior to the pandemic, in 2019, the personal savings rate was 8.8%. It's down to 2.4% in November. So as our credit cards are going up, and we've spent down all that stimulus that we had, we do see some challenges in terms of again, debt going up, but nothing more necessarily going to our savings account. We also talk about inflation. We tend to look at something that's really close to home when it comes to inflation. And this is the index you've never heard about, but it's the only index you never really need. We call it the French Toast Index. And the reason we do that is if you think about French toast, it's bread, milk, and eggs. Those are the staples that are on the grocery list, week in and week out. In November, you were paying 33% more for bread, milk, and eggs than you were in January of this year. The perception is, if you're the person out there that's doing the weekly grocery shopping, if bread, milk, and eggs are costing you 33% more, everything else in the grocery store is costing you 33% more. Truth is, that's probably correct, but that's perception. Perception is reality for the consumer. So that's a real challenge. If I'm spending 33% more to make French toast, well, that's 33% less that someone can spend on our clients' products like hand tools and home improvement projects and everything else. So there is an issue there. So all this kind of factors into, for us, consumer confidence, and where do we see consumer confidence? One measure we look at is we do look at the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Score. They've been tracking that for 60 plus years. In June of 2020, it hit the lowest it ever was at 50. It's come back up to 59, but that's lower than the 71 it was last December and the 81 it was December 2020. So that's a challenge. We're seeing confidence, at its low point in that index. We created an index. We do a Gen Pop study every 2 weeks at Sales Factory, and we created our own anxiety score. What we measure are three things: confidence in the U.S. economy right now, expectations of your household income this year versus last year, and the likelihood that you'll delay purchases based on in times of uncertainty. The year started at about 27%, which means about a quarter of the population felt this anxiety. It's crept up to about 34% at the end of the year. So, we've gone from a quarter to about a third saying that there's anxiety out there. And the more anxious consumers are, the less willing they will be to spend and take on more debt. We did see spikes, that went above 40% when gas went over $5 and mortgages went over 7% for the very first time. So when you look at that, there's a word out there that was one of the words of the year. I don't know if you guys follow that, but permacrisis. Learn that word. That was one of the words of the year. And I think we're still in that permacrisis. And permacrisis, if you're a consumer, means that this just endless sense of instability and insecurity. So we don't think, based on everything that we're seeing, we don't necessarily see consumer confidence taking a turn anytime soon, particularly with a lot of the headlines that we're seeing. So I think from our standpoint, I'm not smart enough to say we're going to be in a recession or not a recession. What we can say is we don't see consumers necessarily opening their wallets anymore, at least through the first half of the year. And I think they're probably at the point right now where they're just waiting for the next shoe to drop. And that will kind of determine, where consumer confidence goes for the second half of 2023. So slightly different take on kind of where we see the economy going, looking at it through the lens of the consumer.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it. What I'd like to do is just kind of ask maybe one or two more questions of the whole panel. You all can answer as you see fit or add on to it. But so businesses, that's our reader. How should they prepare for 2023? What would be your advice from your angle in terms of what they should do? Keep your powder dry or those kind of things. What would y'all suggest? Anyone?
One thing to look at, first off, the federal funds rate is 4.33% right now. I expect it's probably going to go up another 75 to 100 basis points. So you are going to see interest rates rising even further, and that's going to have an impact on businesses. The second one that's already been brought up is labor. Companies are having a hard time finding, people who are qualified. However, companies are expecting that to lessen in the first half of 2023, and I think we will see that. I have a bigger problem long term, but in the short term, I do think that the firms are, needing people. If you ever go into a Walmart, you go into any of these companies and you see a shortage of people. We're seeing these changes a little bit, slowly. I think it's going to pick up in the first half of 2023, and that may help alleviate some of the help issues they have. But firms are still going to have to worry about the investment, especially with interest rates. Housing is down 5.5%, or actually I think 5% decline in housing starts in the past year from last year to this year. So construction has slowed in some areas, but I think you're going to see that picking up a little bit, as well too. Even though we're moving into, as I said, we'll be moving into a recession, I think, sometime this year. But I still think that this area is growing enough that it's not going to be impacted as much as some areas.
Anyone else? No? Okay, that's good. Well, going on the workforce aspect of things, and I think that's the most confounding aspect of all this to all of us is that, I can't find the qualified workers. Every roundtable we've done over the past 5 years, that's been a major concern and for folks and stuff like that. how does that jive with going into a possible recession from that standpoint? I think that's where a lot of people are scratching their heads and stuff like that from that standpoint. Is it still going to be a factor, or will this alleviate that?
I think it'll still be a factor. I do think that the insanity that there was probably in June or July of last year, and that may have been when all of it peaked, right, where suddenly interest rates were popping and everything was getting so expensive. The idea of finding someone new for your company that was willing to come in and work hard and be aggressive and all of those things was just becoming very, very challenging. I think that with the overabundance of anything, right, including open jobs and open positions, they become less valued, right? And for a long, long time, one of the most valuable things in everyone's life was their job, right? What am I doing to give back? What purpose do I have? How do I earn money? How do I feed my family, right? And if everybody has those jobs, they become less valuable, and there's no value to any of them, or a lot less value to any of them. I do think maybe this equilibrium or maybe bouncing back a little bit the other way adds value back to that, where jobs become a little bit more scarce and people value them a little bit more.
That's great.
So Ben, I think one of the things we don't know is we don't know how millennials are going to respond to a recession. If you think about, boomers have lived through 10 recessions, Gen X have lived through 8 recessions. So we've seen this movie before. We kind of know how it ends. But millennials, if you think about the Great Recession, millennials were between the ages of 12 and 27 for the Great Recession. So there weren't a lot of them in the workforce during, what was probably one of the harder recessions that I can recall recently. The balance of power, I think, is going to shift. I think millennials have felt like, and I apologize to any millennials in the room, but millennials have felt like they've had the upper hand on employment and employers, and we all talked about the quiet resignation, everything else. I think the balance of power is going to shift, and like I said, this will be the first real recession that millennials could face, besides the 2-month recession we had when COVID started. So I think a big unknown out there is how are the millennials going to react to a recession, and what companies that you guys work with, how will your organizations wind up dealing with that? Because that's, like I said, I think that's a wild card.
I mean, one of the things affecting, we look at the real estate markets. That's one of the first signals in economic development. We're going to see, right now, there's a real question about downtown real estate. We're seeing like a plethora of leases that aren't being taken, and buildings and people leaving. Will workers come back to work, and are they going to be brought back to work? I think they will. I think it'll be different, but I don't think this vacating the downtowns. I think granite and glass is still going to be valuable at some point, and I think state government will be back at work at some point. I think, so I think that will change. I think we're going to have to adjust to it. It's not going to happen overnight. And if we look at industrial real estate, it's holding in North Carolina on par. Manufacturing real estate, it's on par. And that's a big signal about how strong the economy is going to be going forward. But what we see is the downtowns. That's the optics of what we see. And I don't think we can just look at that. While it is a problem, but it's not the demise of the state because of it.
If I can ask one kind of last question here, what are some opportunities that you see for the state moving forward? What's some good news? Send it on like have a high note here and stuff like that. So specifically to North Carolina, what do y'all see?
Well, one opportunity I'd like to just bring up that is related to the conversation we just had about workers and is as we learn to live with COVID. I don't know that there is a post-COVID era, but we learn to live with it and things return to more to normal. And thank God we're not doing this on Zoom. We're actually here in person with each other. We're paying particular attention to communities where we're hearing anecdotally and also beginning to see some numbers that tell us that people are, and I think I know this from my own life. I know it from the lives of my own employees. We are, everybody on the planet is rethinking how and where and the circumstances under which they want to live their lives. And part of that involves thinking about, we now have workplace flexibility that is probably with us to some extent to stay. There may be some tightening of that as time goes on. I don't know, but I think we are at a place where we're going to have more flexible work days for workers, and it's going to allow them to think about where they live and how they live. And we're seeing some evidence that some small places, smaller towns, where there may be concern about, loss, commercial real estate taking a nosedive to some extent, there may be some investment in some of our smaller places as people make lifestyle decisions about where they want to live their life and under what circumstances. But what we also see is this involves a conversation about the fundamentals of the community or the place that they're thinking about living in. If it's a smaller place, if it's a more rural location, and fundamentals. Number one, broadband. There's got to be good broadband. There's got to be an available labor force if they're looking to hire. There's got to be a strong workforce development system or just local school system if they have school-age children. I've talked to several rural superintendents who see enrollment expanding that had seen enrollment decline, and it's really small numbers, but it's due to second homeowners that primary residence has been in Triangle or Charlotte, making a lifestyle decision to make their permanent residence their second home in a rural community. Now, does that constitute a trend? I have no idea. I hope so. But it'll probably be one of those trends that it's not an equal opportunity for every small town in this state. It's going to be an opportunity for those small towns where the fundamentals are really solid.
Yeah. And I think that one thing though is affordability, particularly in housing, has to be addressed, because I think that's a huge issue. We talk a lot about the growth, and I've only been in Raleigh for 1 year. I'm out in the Apex area, and I just see the boom that's happening. I also talk to a lot of the Gen Zs at the company I work with, and I'm floored by the price of rents that they pay. I'm just absolutely floored. I think for the housing market to continue to kind of reverse itself and start to grow again, the one generational group, the millennials, 52% of millennials do not own a home right now. And I think I've heard recently that like about 22% of millennials think they'll never own a home because of the affordability is out there. So I think for the housing market to get rid of some of the inventory that's being built and everything else, are we addressing the affordability issues for the millennials to get more of them to be in as homeowners?
To go out on a high note, as you said, I've read something recently about the growth and not just in the urban areas, in the rural areas as well. But I always try to put perspective with that, right? And I saw Charlotte grew its population by about 74,000 people last year, and I started to think about that and what that meant. And if you think about the thriving market of Wilmington, I think in the News and Observer this morning it was talking about Wilmington being one of the fastest growing or in migration cities in the country. And then when I say Wilmington, I mean kind of Jacksonville to Southport, out to Burgaw and Leland and all of it together. It's a big, thriving place. And if you think about the growth in Charlotte and the growth in Raleigh, Charlotte would have to build something that size every 3 years to keep up with that population growth, right? So if you think about all those houses and all those shopping centers and all those office buildings and all those restaurants and all that infrastructure, right, and all those roads, you've got to build that every 3 years, right? In Raleigh, it's probably about every 4 years you have to build that. And if you think about what that takes and what that means, and it's not just those two markets that are growing, right? You have Asheville, Greensboro, and the Triad are growing. The state is growing, and I just think we're really well positioned, and we're going to continue to grow for the next decade. I can't see much to slow that down.
I agree with that. Capital is going to flow where it's treated best, and we've done what Tony was saying. What we've done over the last decade, really, and going back 17, 18, and seeing all the things that have come and continue to come. And then we talk about, Patrick, the broadband investment that's there. I have a friend who was a legislator in Texas and retired. Again, he was one of those involuntary retirees in politics. But he had a financial advising business, and it's pretty lucrative, and it's a pretty big outfit that he had in Texas. But loves Cashiers, North Carolina. When he first got to Cashiers, he didn't have the broadband connection he needed. But of course, built a big house out there, as folks like to do, and he loves the mountains. But as broadband came in, as more and more people in his firm, he's semi-retired. His son and daughter are involved in the business too, and they're, again, a lot of wealth involved. But as broadband came online there, and of course they would come visit and fall in love with Cashiers too. Half the firm has now moved to Cashiers. They do most of their business in Cashiers, North Carolina. It's not a company that we had to go out and incentivize to come to North Carolina. They migrated here. And business is happening online there. But it also means that there's even more wealth coming into the state. One, that's important to have as we continue to grow that from a rural perspective and open up those markets to businesses just like that and those top opportunities. It's not always 500 jobs or 1,000 jobs. It's those smaller firms too that contribute. So that's very important to think about. And then that workforce thing, making sure that we've got that pipeline of kids who want to go to work, because it's a different world for them. Having a 14-year-old, I see how he sees the world and what they think about is going to work and a job. And this is also a generation now that will have gone to school at least part-time online. And his charter school still has days where they just do it online because they've been effective at being able to educate students that way. And we heard the presentation about how Campbell has all these different offerings for workforce, for folks who want to get back into the workforce in a different way and earn an education. They can do it from home. They can do it from wherever they're at. So as we do that and finding out how we shape the state from an infrastructure standpoint is incredibly important too. And if we've got smaller areas or more rural areas, however you want to say it, that have that kind of adaptability, it means more investment and more options for those folks who want a different lifestyle. I have to live in downtown Raleigh when I'm here. I like the fact that at home I'm not far from Charlotte or Hickory or Gastonia, but I actually get to still smell when the dairy farm puts out their stuff on the fields and getting ready, right? So and it's just in our back door. So I'm close to a lot of things. But from a lifestyle perspective, it's a great place to raise a son and raise a family and be that close to everything that's there. So we have a lot to offer. It's just making sure that those areas that, when you look at southeastern North Carolina and the investments that we've made as a state into how we're delivering rural health care and how we're delivering services to those folks. And when everyone has access to it, it really puts us in a good place. So going past what may happen this year, I do think that we continue to do with the best with what we've got and been very, very smart in how we've invested, and I think we'll continue to do that. So we'll weather through whatever happens this year, but as we continue to grow that, we become a much different state than most, because that's not the way they do it. You see a lot of concentration of wealth in the urban areas and rural areas. They don't see that type of investment. We've done, I think, when I say we, as a partnership, as a state, we've done that very well together. It's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out eventually.
I also think the prices, the rents are already going down, and we'll continue to see that happening. One of the things that has happened, millennials are more likely to live alone as opposed to when I was 20, I lived with 3 other people. So you're seeing that, but we do need to keep building. With the growth rate of this population, one thing that does happen is there's a lot of obstacles for developers to get stuff built. It adds about 25% onto the price of a home. And so, yeah, it is going to be harder for people to buy into that. So hopefully legislatures will start looking at you can't have an increasing demand without increasing the supply and expect a big change. So hopefully that'll happen. But I think the growth in the population is really going to be a big factor that does help us. It will continue providing the labor force that's needed.
That's great. Last word from Tony.
I want to say something, probably nobody's expecting this, but one of the things that goes into all of these projects, I've been involved in every big project probably since 2017, is energy. in energy cost and predictable energy in the amount of it. I mean, no one expected me to sit here and talk about our shareholder utilities or whatever providing, but not one of these projects has been denied adequate power. And some of them are hundreds of megawatts. Go home and look up how many houses is a megawatt and how many millions of dollars a megawatt cost of electricity. Natural gas is another thing. There'll be no large manufacturing without natural gas. It will not happen. And so North Carolina, the integrity of our energy network is really second to none. That's not what we see in the press or the media, and I'm not letting anybody off the hook with it. But we have to maintain the integrity of that and continue to keep building those sources if we're going to grow. I mean, a semiconductor plant can use almost the whole capacity of a nuclear power plant. I mean, that's what it takes in electricity. And not one of these projects I've worked on has been denied adequate power.
Folks, when we get done, if you want to speak with some of our panel, if they'll stay a little bit, maybe ask them a question personally or say hello and stuff like that. But in the meantime, let's give them a big hand.